Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Martin. I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thanks for joining us today on YouTube. And we are here for what I know will be a very fascinating conversation with Karina Simonson, who is an art historian and interdisciplinary scholar focusing on cultural connections between the Baltics and the Global South in the 20th and 21st centuries. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Vilnius Academy of Arts, where she's working on her first monograph, provisionally titled Representations of Africa and Asia in Soviet Lithuanian Children's Culture, 1945 to 1990, Origins, Influences, Circulation, and After Effects. Her research interests include the cultural production of the Eastern European African diaspora, South African Jewish history and culture, questions of academic positionality, and cultural appropriations in the Baltics. Karina has a degree from the University of Cape Town and holds a PhD in art history and criticism from the Lithuanian Culture Research Institute. Today, Karina will be talking about her postdoctoral book project, which is complex research on Soviet Lithuanian children's visual culture, revealing the representations of African and Asian history, culture, and people, and contextualizing them in related research of children's literature, theater, film, and music. This research links with the Soviet fraternity of peoples, ideology, and geopolitical interests. And she'll also offer some possible hypotheses of the origins of present-day manifestations of racism. So, Karina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this beautiful introduction. And thank you so much for the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies for inviting me for this talk. It's really an honor to talk to such an audience. And thank you all for coming, and for those who are online, or for those who watch and listen to it later. So maybe first briefly, I'll touch about my research, what I'm doing generally, and then we'll narrow down to the specific research. So, I'm sitting on kind of three chairs. So my doctoral dissertation was on South African Jewish photography, and about two photographers who originated from Baltics and then who did their career in South Africa. And then also my second chair will be, I'll teach a course on encounters of Africa and Asia. So it's another very big topic and very big part of my time and my attention. And the most recent will be one in Soviet studies. And so everything, all about connections between the Baltics and the African during the 20th century. And that's where my postdoc research originated from. So now we'll move to today's talk. So I'll walk you through my research in this way. I'll talk a bit about the prehistory, so how I started, then about sources and geography, so about the journey itself, and then where I'm heading, so the book, or how I see the book. So last year, I was awarded by the Research Council of Lithuania a postdoctoral fellowship for the research project at Vilnius Academy of Arts, titled Representations of Africa and Asia in Soviet Lithuanian Children's Culture, 1945-1990, Origins, Influences, Circulation, and After Effects. And this fellowship was also funded by European Union Social Fund. Honestly, being realistic and knowing the Lithuanian science, I was really very much surprised, because it's not a priority in our science in these days. So I was 9 out of 250 proposals, which all together was on laser technologies and political sciences and health and ecology and climate change and migration, so all kind of really highly prioritized topics today. And I thought me with art history on something which still unfortunately looks very marginal in our humanities. I thought, wow, that's a really big progress. So I was really happy about that. And this is how I'm navigating my interdisciplinary research. I kind of decided I maybe should show. So I'm an art historian. I was trained as art historian. And then my first move was into African studies. We focused in South Africa. Then the Jewish studies were always there because it was South African Jewish photographers. Then when I'm doing this teaching at Vilnius University, the Asian studies comes in. So I have like another, which should be like, it's a huge area, but unfortunately it's still much smaller than African studies for me. And sometimes I notice that I'm quite unbalanced doing my research now, though it should be similar. I should go equally on both, but just naturally I still tend to focus more on the African illustration, let's say, if we talk about the illustrations. And then the Soviet studies comes in, which on one hand before was very something like I never dealt with them. So I was researching South African, even it was still 20th century, it was quite far from Soviet studies. It was Jewish studies, African studies, it was somewhere far away. Then when I teach African and Asian encounters, it's still very far away. I mean, sure that we have this, the Soviet Sino split, and we have all kind of, but you can't give students so much information. So kind of keep them. We try not to talk about Europe and America so much. We talk about Africa and Asia. And now I have to come back home, kind of, and see what we have here, what kind of issues and challenges we have back home, which is extremely interesting, but also a big challenge for me. So even when I grew up during the Soviet times, I still can't articulate properly many things. So this is kind of how I see my current research, and the Jewish studies, they're now kind of outside, but they also give me a lot of instruments and kind of instruments to approach certain things in certain theories and certain subjects. So it's really useful. And who knows, maybe I still have to add them. So obviously there were a lot of voices, and maybe even those in the audience who would ask me, so why do you need to do such a research? Like we don't have Lithuania don't have colonial history. We don't have a lot of like a big diaspora. Like, why would you do that? And that's a good question, because yes, like why should be that a priority? Why should be funded by the fellowship? So there are a few reasons that are there to argue that. So first of all would be the Lithuanians' involvement in globalization processes, which is still very much underrated. And not necessarily those ones which we have since we joined EU, since we have EU membership, but also those alternative forms of globalization across the socialist world during the Cold War, which also very much under-researched. Then the second reason would be that Soviet Lithuanian children's culture is very much insufficiently researched. So it's a bit more the literature, but not the visual aspect is still very fragmentally researched. Then the third reason would be that this research will go beyond the local research. It will fill the gap in Eastern European research, because usually when we talk about representations of race, we think about Western Europe or US, but definitely not the Eastern Europe as such, and not in Lithuania. So that will be the third reason, which is very important. Then we also need to expand our vocabulary when we talk about race. Like Lithuanian language doesn't have many words. We're not used to express our opinions about these topics in Lithuanian. So even I sometimes struggle how to put it properly. Some words we still borrow from Russian or from English. We try to adopt them, but we don't have enough practice. We have to talk more about that in Lithuanian without borrowing the concept and the words and using the Lithuanian ones. But the most important one for me is that analyzing the literature and the illustration, the visual culture of Soviet times, I would try to understand how those who grew up during those times, what influenced them, because this is now this active citizens who make the decision, participate in the conversation, who participate in the politics. So how they were influenced by those Soviet imagery, by the cartoons, by the illustrations, by the movies, by the theater productions, how now they can talk about the race, about immigration, about the same topics, the same sensitive topics. So I think that will be for me the most important one. So we can try to trace what could influence. So moving on now to the research. So the object of the research is Lithuanian children's culture of Soviet era and its objects, which is in one way or another speaks about Africa and Asia. And I decided to concentrate only on people. So I don't look into the nature, into the architecture. If it's connected with people, if it's the same image, then it's okay. But I don't look into the like crocodiles and ornaments and, you know, like, for example, when talk about the Dr. Aibolit, which is very, very famous story, but we have mostly nature and animals there. And every second person will tell me, oh, look into that. And I looked into many publications, many versions of this book, but it's only mostly nature. So even if the story, yes, it's based in Africa, somewhere in Africa, it's not really relevant for my research. So the work will primarily look into the visual representation, so the books and magazines, illustrations, posters, animated films, photographs, and then I will connect it with literature, translations of the local and the translated literature, theater performances, films, TV shows, drama shows. And the aim of the research is to conduct a complex historical inquiry into representations of African and Asian history, culture, and people in Soviet era Lithuanian children's visual culture, contextualizing them in parallel research on children's literature, theater, and film, linking with Soviet fraternity of peoples, ideology, and its geopolitical interest, and provide a deep understanding into the current racial politics of Lithuania. So, finishing off with this prehistory, I can now move off to this probably the biggest chunk of the presentation. I'll talk about the sources and the geography. And especially to start, especially for those who usually ask me, so really how much do you find, like, is it, like, what do you find, like, what kind of sources? This is for now the amount of single units of source, which I found in Lithuanian archives and libraries and different kind of collections, primary material with these illustrations of Asia and Africa. And it's much more than I expected in the beginning. When I applied, I knew that we have, but I didn't know it's going to be that much. And I think I'll still find some more because the material keep coming, you know, wherever you go. I kind of supposed to stop at some moment, as with every writing, but I thought we don't have that much. So I kind of have everything. And now I see I still have to stop somewhere without having all. And that's, I don't know how I'm going to deal with that. Like every scholar, you know, that is painful. But it is much more than everybody expected. So as I mentioned a bit before, so there's different types of material. So I grouped it into four groups. So the first would be the printed materials, which will be the biggest ones. So illustrations in books and magazines, and posters and postcards. Then the screen, so it's cartoons and movies. Cartoons, it's also it's a big part, but it's least researched for now. So I'm working now primarily, I started with the printed material. So the cartoons and movies I kind of I think I found more or less all what we had. It's not that many, but some of them are really interesting and provide the context. Then the stage, so the theater plays, I think it's not that many of them, so I kind of have it all. And then the fourth, which came quite late, or the latest part, is the toys part, which I didn't think before, not when I applied, no later, but I discovered when I was doing some other research, and I thought like, wow, so we have quite a big collection of Black toys in Lithuanian museums and also in Estonian museums, which was like interesting for me. I didn't find that much in Latvia, but in Estonia, they have. I'll talk about this a bit later. So this is also a very interesting part, but it's the objects I never worked with. So illustrations, photography, I'm used to as an art historian, but toys, it's not exactly, it's somewhere in between. So it's interesting, and I think I need to to gather much more secondary sources, secondary literature to engage with that, especially dealing not with Lithuanian toys, but with black dolls. It's another area of research. So now moving on again, because I collected such a massive amount of data, so I thought I need to organize it in some way. So more or less for now, the bigger part will be the material related to Asia, and the smaller will be like about Africa. But a lot of material also you can't attribute specifically. Some of them, it's somewhere in between. So I think it also would be interesting. I didn't have time for that yet, but I would like to do the graphs to see at what period chronological, like in time, the representation of specific area peaked, because there were change from Asia to Africa. So, you know, when that happened, then to correlate with political events. And I also kind of tried to see material by country. It's also, again, some materials you can't attribute specifically to any African country or any. With Asia, it's a bit easier. They were better. They were more clear. But with African countries, a lot of material, unfortunately, just one big Africa, which you can't. But more or less still the China, like it's more than a half for now, which I did. So it is also interesting to see. So now moving on to the geography. So I did first like a bigger I wanted to see a bigger landscape. So I looked at the Eastern European context to see what was going on there. And I went to the Munich Youth Library, International Youth Library, which holds probably one of the biggest collection, or the biggest collection of the children books of the area. So with the help of the staff, we kind of tried to make a list, which were the most popular books on Africa or Asia during the period. It's not, it's not final, but that's kind of what we have. So the Uncle Tom's Cabin, if it's not African Asia, but representing the Black. So the staff said, let's put it at number 1. I mean, it's just more for a picture, so for to understand. Then Mowgli, Dr. Ibalit, King Solomon Mines, and Nobi will be this top 5 that we found. So this is Nobi. This was one of the most popular stories about Africa and Eastern Germany, and there is many different translations across Eastern Europe in different languages. This is the Lithuanian one, which actually they copy-pasted from one of the German ones, so illustrations, everything is the same. But the other ones, you can see they're very different. It's about child somewhere in old time, Asian times in Africa. Then the King Solomon's Mines. Also, there are many different publications, very different style, very different illustrations. Then the Dr. Ibalit, which I still looked at.
Is that similar to Dr. Doolittle?
Yes, he wrote it after. I mean, there is few version of his inspiration. Yes, true. Dr. Ibalit, what was really interesting for me, so they have in many illustrations, they have the Barmali, that pirate, which in many cases is portrayed as a Turkish kind of Ottoman Turkey style dressed man. And I was wondering, where is this coming from? Like, why? Not in all of them, but in some, let's say in half of them, what I saw, where it is coming from. And I found one version that actually during those times, the Turks were popular pirates, like next to the shores of Africa. So that's why it was correct that the artist portrayed Barmali as a Turkish man. And also the name came from Bayram Ali, which is a proper name of Turkish Muslim origin. So that was one of the versions, because I was really not upset, but I was struggling why the artist will picture him like that. Like, what is the connections? Like, why is it again just like making him looking different and exotic? And I was like, not like why some would do and some would not. And then I found this explanation with them kind of calms me down. That's probably there was some reason, not just making him an exotic, looking exotic for Soviet readers. Then I'm moving on to the Baltic context. So I also worked in National Library of Latvia, National Library of Estonia. So I collected material what they have, but I focused only on periodicals, so on the magazines, on children magazines. And in Latvia, that was Zilite, Berniva, and Pioneers. So there's few illustrations from what they have. Also very interesting to me. And this, we do have some political articles about the African history as well. Then I looked what Estonia have. They also have some very interesting material in their magazines. With this, it's very curious. I didn't have time yet to research more on that, but Estonian artists quite often portray Estonian kids in very dark color, because this is not African kids. And it happens quite often. I don't know. This style of, or I don't know, we can probably discuss that. What does this mean? Is it just dark-tanned Europeans? So it's not the one cover. I noticed like quite a few of them, this style, but I didn't see that in Latvian and definitely not in Lithuanian illustration. In Estonia, I also have quite a few magazines. It's Taheke, Pioneer, Sure, Norus, and Sada. So I have quite a few articles for kids, or they had. Okay, now let's move to how I see the final result of the book. So the final result of my project, of my research, should be a book, which, I mean, obviously I'm still, it's still in the process, but I'll try to overview what I have for now. So for now, it looks like it's going to be 4 chapters. I mean, I'm not talking about introduction and then conclusions. That's obvious. So first, I will look into historical, political, and cultural context, then into personal encounters, and then something that I call peripheral agencies. So that's exactly the connections between Baltics and African and Asian countries. So without going through the center, through the Moscow. So was it possible? How it was possible? How we imagined? Because a lot of that was just imagined connections. And then this is the last chapter title is not just really provisional. It's all provisional chapters. So let's look a bit more in detail. So to the historical context. So the historical context, there's quite a lot of reflections of historical and political events in children's magazines. So for example, this one is the June issue of 1941, commemorating International Children's Day. The readers are introduced to Congolese political leader and independence activist Patrice Lumumba. So this is Lithuanian, this is Viennese, this is Lithuanian magazine. So we have this picture of Lumumba and then some story about him, about his fight. And then this is Latvian, I think. And this is Latvian also with Lumumba. And then this is interesting. This is the work of traditional Lithuanian woodcraft also about Lumumba. Like who would expect this to happen? Like this is traditional woodcrafts, and like one of our artists in 60s decided to do that. So that's why we, as I mentioned in the beginning, it would be interesting to do the graph when we have those peaks of representations, because the politics were represented quite nicely in the magazines. Then the wars in Vietnam and Korea was quite a lot also talked about and presented in different ways. This is, I think, from Estonian magazine. This is Latvian. Also Latvian. Sometimes even the whole issue would be dedicated to Korea or Vietnam, which I think also, yeah, for example, the September 1968 was dedicated just to Vietnam. There were many stories about Vietnam, about the French colonizers and capitalist Americans and the two Vietnams, the good and the bad, and the fight, and then at the end of the main story, the good Soviet children extend a helping hand and write, quoting, "We live in Soviet Lithuania. It feels nice and fun. Today we have learned a great deal about your country, and now we love you even more, especially the partisans who heroically fight against the Americans. We will send you our creative works and drawings as a gift." So there, yes, so there were quite a lot of illustrations dedicated to Vietnam and Korea. Then another big part of illustrations, or even the whole spread in the magazines, were dedicated to, you know, this contrast, how the kids are living in non-communist countries, non-socialist countries, and then, you know, the nice bright future of the socialists, of the kids living in the socialist country. So that was a very popular way of, so on the one page, they'll have this usually black and white, you know, starving kids, and then on the other one, they'll have singing, dancing, color photo of the Soviet children. It's actually Lithuanian festival of song and dance. And usually they also use that on the Children's Day, on the June 1st. Usually all the magazines, they'll put something like about the kids in the world. And they also would use that for the New Year. So they will present the picture of happy children, happy Soviet children going to celebrate the New Year, and then they will write something. But you know, not all the kids in the world are happy today. Some kids in the capitalist countries, they have to work from dawn to like 24 hours, and they're not going to receive gifts. And like, don't forget them, and like extend your friendly hand to them, and there will be like another drawings and another story about the poor kids in capitalist countries. And they would use also some text which would start or finish with something like, "Soviet tourists who have visited capitalist countries are surprised to see many children on the streets. They're sleeping there, looking for food, begging." So yeah, that will be the popular type of political message. Then yeah, that's exactly this type of this is also from Lithuanian Viennese. Yeah, this is the New Year, the December issues. So that will be that. To translate that, not everywhere now is the winter. So in Africa, it's warm now. In Africa, there is no snow and no Christmas trees, and there the black boys and girls play under the palm trees, but not all of them can play and have fun. A lot of them are used by not colonizers, by the bosses, by the. So the New Year is not a happy time in capitalist places, countries. So and so on. So it was also very interesting type of very visual and very clear message. Yeah, and also some of them were like that, not so colorful, but also very clear. This is from Latvia.
It's so interesting because even the Black children who are celebrating are represented so crudely. They're not really wearing clothes. He doesn't have pants on, right?
That's everywhere.
Whereas the other kids who are celebrating, they
Yeah.
all have pants on, or their
Yeah.
bottoms are covered. So it's interesting that there's not even a sharp contrast between the laboring Black children, right, and the
Yeah.
celebrating Black children. They are both depicted as sort of less than, right?
Yeah, this aspect of clothing, it's you can see it in many illustrations, but I decided I'm not going to stress it during this presentation because I want to see the whole picture, because it's sensitive topic. So I thought I'll have to see more, and then kind of to go deeper to understand this way of representation. But yes, if you notice, that's correct. Okay, now talking about the political context, we sure have to talk about the friendship of people, which was one of the most important aspects of Soviet soft power. So this is the monument which we had in Klaipėda, in our seaport city, for the friendship of people. It's not there anymore. It was resurrected and kind of reminding Lithuania that Klaipėda was saved from Nazis also by this friendship of people, because it was the figures of the men of three different races, the classical type. But also we have this type of presentation. I just should put together. This is the cookies produced by Vilnius factory. So they have this type of decoration there of them. And here it goes, the type of the illustration that become quite common and quite popular later. So this is already in 1954 when you can see the Black girl appearing in the Lithuanian magazine. This is the first in this period that I'm looking at. And it was drawn by quite very famous Lithuanian artist, Sofia Levyrytė. And this is just the first, it's not the cover, but it's the first when we open the magazine. So really in the beginning. And then this motif of the doves, of the white doves, became immensely popular in representing the friendship of people. This is just Lithuanian magazines, but you can see plenty of them in different styles. This is more early, this is 56, 63. This one I don't remember, so that became very popular. But again, if not talking about the clothes, but talking about the color, I mean, this gray color, I mean, I just try to understand, I still need to look more in the sense, sometimes the quality of the paper and the typography, the press was not good enough, but I don't think that's enough to, to argue for this gray, I don't know which color. And in that one also, I mean, it's, yeah, so the motifs with doves became very popular. Then there were another way to present this friendship of people, this more creative way used by advertising. So this is advertising of Lithuanian bicycle company from Šiauliai, and they run the story in Viennese magazine and this children magazine. So about how the bicycles of this factory is used in all countries, in all directions in the world. So it's Europe, Asia, Africa, America. So they all cycle these bicycles. And then this is the advertisement of the same factory, which yes, you see the clothing, like it's. So this how the advertisement used that image, or that aspect of friendship of people. And yes, if this is very stereotypical, but also the way the Japanese girl is presented with this parasol behind her, I don't think it's really comfortable cycling with opened umbrella, but because the Japanese supposed to be with umbrellas, so it was nothing depicted like that.
And how demure she looks with her head down and her eyes.
I mean, there's many things. I mean, we're not going into the details because almost about every picture we can talk more, but I try just to present the overview about how much we have and how much we can talk about and go deeper. And this, I think it's somewhere in the story, it says that many children in Europe, Africa, Asia, America, and Australia ride bicycles made in Cholet. They're all very grateful to the diligent workers of this factory, to all Soviet people. And according to the factory, these Cholet bicycles were sold in China, Finland, Poland, Bulgaria, Mexico, Iceland, Ghana, Uruguay, and Syria. And this factory, I think it's still working, it's still in business. Then one of the popular ways to express this friendship of people was through the alphabet, was emphasizing the importance of education in bringing this or in building this bright socialist tomorrow. So this is an example of Birutė Žilytė cover for the September 65 number of Guinness magazine, Lithuanian magazine. So which also used, interestingly, just on the front cover. On the back cover, there is all of them, I think, less European, but in the front, she used some of the images. Yeah. And around 89, as Lithuanian independence was approaching, this theme of friendship of people ran out and was only commemorated on the June 1st, on this International Children's Day. So now the second chapter, I would like to talk about this personal encounters, what I mean. So there were quite a few ways for the Lithuanians have encountered with African Asians or with African Asia. So the first was the official visits of Communist Party members, which we're not going to talk about. Then the second was the culture workers' travels, which often went hand in hand with those official delegations. So, for example, the Minister of Culture would travel, then some of the most important elite culture writers would, for example, go together, would travel together. Then the third type will be the scientists and travelers who were lucky to get out and travel to some destinations they were interested in. And then on the way back, they would publish their memories. I mean, on return, they'll publish their memories. So, for example, this is the photo of dance and song assembled from some, it's not just even some national assemble, but it's from the factory, two factory runners, and they visited Africa. Made a picture. And then this is the example of those writers and scientists who went to Africa and then published on the return. So this is the writer, Vytautas Sirius Gera, who worked as a medical doctor on the ship, and then on the way back he published travel. It's actually the people working on this in international ships were also quite popular categories. So some of them were publishing on the return. Some of them are taking a lot of pictures, some of them are writing. On the return, there was those type of insights into the life outside the curtain. And the fifth type will be the Asian and African delegations coming to Africa, to Lithuania. So that will be, or other Soviet republics. That will be the fifth type. And quite often those writers who would travel to Asia or Africa on the way back, or when they return, they will publish in the children magazines. And their stories, they're like short kid stories about, some, I don't know, kids in some Chinese school, how they happy, to meet Soviet friends or something else about Ghanaian pioneers. So different topics. So that will be this types. So let's see more in detail. So this is one of the cases when the cultural workers went. This is the first one, is a bit of an exception because this is the Yiddish writer Avram Tubskever, who traveled to South Africa, but he traveled already from Israel. But he published a collection of poems, Africa, Elephants by Night, Poems of Africa, which got published, and then we could read it as well later, sure. So we could have this type of photographs of Zulu warriors. And this is the picture of Lithuanian designer, woman designer Maria Livia Stopulonina, who was working on the design in Guinea, who was invited. The Soviets were building a lot of hotels and stadiums and hospitals in African socialist countries or Asian socialist countries. And quite often, or sometimes, Lithuanian designers were invited to work there on those projects. So in this case, she was a furniture designer. She spent 3 months working in Guinea in one of the hotels. And that's the picture from there. And this is the type of the visits to Lithuania. This is the delegations. Sometimes they were coming to the Moscow to one of those youth festivals. Sometimes they were coming directly. And this is one of the cases when it was titled that it enjoyed dancing with them, with children. Another is the Nigeria Peace Society delegation, workers of the Network Workers of Communist Youth Committee. The Angola Women's Handball team visited Lithuania to prepare for the Central African Games. Yeah, so different kind of visits, as you can see. Yeah, they're also then talking about again about the Vietnam and Korea. Sometimes we have those protests on the streets. So 66. Hundreds of students from Vilnius of the technical school marched to the street of Vilnius carrying these banners. So that was another type of encounters, you could say. Also a lot of cultural events, Vietnam and Korean singers or like orchestras were coming to Vilnius to perform in our music halls. It's also quite popular. Then Lithuanian children also have means to encounter people from various different countries and practice this friendship of people. So one of them was Arctic summer camp, and this is actually a Lithuanian delegation in Arctic. And the Arctic has this, it was like separated in 2 parts. So one was internal for those kids coming from Soviet republics, and another was the international one. But in the beginning, I didn't know that. And when my mom told me that she has been to Arctic, I was like, wow, so do you have these photos? I need them. She said, no, she was just in that in for the Soviet republics. She said to get to that international one, you could only be, the daughter or the son of some, top of the cream. So she wasn't the one. So, and it also began to present itself as a flagship of international cooperation during the Cold War, and Arctic was showcasing the Soviet system to the world. According to Matthias Newman, through a structured regime of mental and physical activities alongside interaction with population of young Soviets, quoting, children from across the world were supposed to transform into peace activists sympathetic to the Soviet worldview. They would start to re-evaluate their views on ongoing events in the world and understand the correctness of Soviet foreign policy and present the Soviet Union as a peace-loving, multi-ethnic nation. Therefore, would enjoy the policy of peace and friendship between all countries, races, and nationalities. So Lithuanian children were also sometimes lucky to get a ticket to the Arctic. Some of Lithuanian writers were also lucky to get there to work as supervisors of the group leaders in these camps. And on the return, they would write a book, usually a book or collection of stories about the experience. So, for example, Matutis, and then Matutis wrote about Artek, and then it was illustrated, with blue color. So that was also quite popular. Yeah, quite a few books were published about Artek. Then another way of the connection of the experience was the pen pals, which also flourished in Lithuania. It was another popular way of making international friends. So a lot of these addresses were published in some pioneers newspapers. So we have them in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. We also have the Russian ones circulated. So you could find the address, but more of them were from the socialist bloc, but sometimes you can find like this one, which is a Kenyan student. So sometimes you could find Chinese or some faraway addresses. Okay, now moving to the third and fourth chapters. These two ones are more in the flux currently. So if talking about the first and second are more or less clear what I'm doing and what kind of material we have. But with the third and fourth, it's still much more in the process. But for this third chapter, I'm very much inspired by the James Mark book, Alternative Globalizations, Eastern Europe and the Postcolonial World. And there is a few quotes that I would like to read, just explaining the light and or the inspiration, which I get from his book. So the idea of Western capitalism as the only engine of globalization bequeathed a distorted view of socialist and post-colonial states as inward-looking, isolated, and cut off from global trends until the capitalist takeover in the 80s and 90s. Such accounts ignore not only the agency of so-called peripheries in the creation of global interconnection, but also the possibility that interconnection between peripheries might be considered a form of globalization, similar to the intensification of interaction between the West and the rest. Another quote from him is, which I like, nor have histories of socialism taken up this challenge with enthusiasm. The understanding of how socialist projects across the globe were connected economically, politically, and culturally is still limited. The research remains fragmented. Area studies specialists deals with socialism in their world regions so that, for example, African studies scholars investigate African socialism. An ongoing division between post-communism and post-colonial scholars has resulted in, until recently, little interest in bringing together stories of a broader socialist world. Histories of socialism in Europe rarely take into consideration how the trajectories in the other world regions and transregional connections are part of their histories too. If it was not for socialist globalization, there would have been no Mozambican and Angolan contract workers in Saxony, no Chinese development aid workers in Tirana, no Soviet-Cuban encounters in Addis Ababa, no Cuban female factory workers in Hungary, and no Polish engineers in Ghana. North Koreans would not have shared their preferred architectural styles with colleagues in Bucharest, their expertise in stadium choreography with Ethiopians, and their military strategies with Mexican and Namibian guerrillas. Southern Yemenis would not have studied alongside Sri Lankans at universities in Ukraine, and Vietnamese and Cuban doctors would not have worked in the Congo and Angola. These multiply connections and encounters had an impact on the political economies of post-colonial states, shaped new patterns of social and economic mobility transregionally, and still inform new modes of political opposition in the global south. So this is some of those ideas that I feel are very important for my research, which I need not to forget. But another side, as I showed in the beginning, the way I see my trans research, I already have that bigger view, but sometimes I need to connect it better. And moving to to this, currently I have here the chapter where I will talk about the dolls, or start talking about the dolls, which is very interesting but very sensitive topic. So, which was very unexpected reflection on this ideology of friendship of people. So we can find this is a Lithuanian book by Spurgaitė, Julia Pukė and her friends, where you can see there were drawings how to create a doll of different nationalities, different ethnicities. You can make a black doll, an Asian doll, or any kind of doll. There. Then this is the picture from Saint Denis, so you can knit, the doll for yourself. This is one of the examples, of handmade dolls, Lithuanian handmade dolls. And Lithuanian toy museum have quite a few of them. Yeah, this is a sensitive topic. I say it again, in their collection, this is handmade during the Soviet times. And as I said, the Estonian museum have quite a lot of them, and I have a communication with their director, and she said that, just see, that during, that's her words, the director of the museum, that during Soviet time, black dolls were quite common in the shops, and people bought them for presents to children and also for grown-ups to decorate their room. Some people have said that they bought a black doll because there was nothing else to buy from a shop because of the deficit, and to buy anything at all, they bought a black doll, because when you need a doll, it doesn't matter what color. A doll is a doll. This was quite common understanding, and many contributors to the museum have said that to me when they have given their childhood dolls to our collection. Grown-ups have said that they brought black dolls and not white because they seem to be more exclusive and different. So in their museums, almost every, how they say, that part of the exhibition will feature the black doll. So it's not something like exclusive for their collection. And I think I'll stop here. I think I'm already taking more time than we should. And I'm open for questions.
I'll start with a few questions, and then if anything comes in on YouTube, and obviously if you have a question, yes, please. Thank you, Karina. This is really, really interesting. As you can see, I wrote down a lot of different things. Okay, in terms of obviously the perspective on race is much different, and I would imagine probably more complicated here in the US, but you can tell me better than that. When you showed those dolls in that Lithuanian museum, I couldn't help but wondering if there's any pushback on the representation of artifacts like this, or in what kind of context is provided around these kinds of dolls in that exhibit.
There is no pushback, not as much as I know. I mean, I met with the director of Lithuanian Museum. No, he didn't say anything about that. He just collected all the material they had of Asian. Almost both museums don't have any Asian toys, but quite a few of black. No, they don't present any specific context, just as, they'll maybe tell a bit of the story, how the doll came into the museum, but not it's no history of representation.
Yeah.
If that was the question. No, the history is not there.
That's interesting.
But yeah, I understand that to present that in American context, it's probably
very jarring from an American perspective. And to have it without the context makes it seem there's no educational value,
and
right?
This is the handmade, right? You can see, and these were factory produced. A lot of them were. I mean, as much as we know, we did have a doll factory in the Baltics, so most of them were produced in Moscow. There were a few other factories who produced the dolls. A lot of them, as the directors would say, were cheap copies of the East German or American version of those dolls. But no, we don't, our museums don't provide any, they presented, at least as you see in this Estonian one, just as any other doll.
So I'm also curious, excuse me, about what you believe or what your research has shown you about the goal of having either visual representation of African children, Asian children, or obviously having actual dolls that children could theoretically play with that are children of color. Obviously you've talked about the friendship of the people, and that's from the state side. You can understand why the state would want that to be part of their ideological argument. But from more of a consumer side or an everyday person side, what do you think they saw the rationale for why there was so much effort or representation around this multicultural lens? So in the US, we would say that it's about representation, right? We want things to look like what the American population looks like. We want Black children to be able to go to the store and buy Black dolls. We want Asian children to be able to watch television shows and see themselves represented. But in communities that were potentially much less ethnically diverse, what do you think sort of the underlying rationale was, if there was anything more than just sort of the ideological push for the friendship of the people?
Yeah, I think I'll get to that at the end of my research, because until, as I said, I would like to see this, the amount of representation to correlate with the political events that will really help my research. And yeah, probably I still need to collect more and to give that answer.
Yeah, and this question, I wondered, it's similar, I think.
It's really important question, but I don't have an answer.
Yeah, how do you gauge the impact, right? Without doing like sociological research and surveys, right? To see how people actually felt or how their opinions were shaped. If one of the questions that you're posing is about the origins of racial attitudes within the country, how it's, obviously it wasn't, our attitudes towards everything are shaped by our environment largely, not just the media, but certainly partly the media. So I wondered if you had any plans to think about how to use either surveys or sociological research to think about how these visual representations actually, what mark they made.
Yeah, that kind of would be another part of research to see, like to go from 90 onwards and to see, how current schools and kindergartens, what kind of plays they stage, what kind of literature they read, what is in our school textbooks, But that's kind of a big part.
Huge.
It's something else. But what I can observe, just even simple things, how people would use the names of those old books, to call, for example. My son is mixed race, so they would call him using that name. And for my son, that doesn't matter. That he doesn't really, he knows where it's coming from, the cartoon, but he doesn't react in any, like so what? Well, for me, it triggers, and I'm not sure it doesn't trigger that negatively, that badly as probably that would happen here. But it still triggers, and I'm not the only one with that experience. So it's still, but I'm not sure if I should put everything in one book. I mean, it's a lot. Maybe just, as a footnote or as some, just influence or inspirations. But we do have those, if we then, the blackface, I mean, if you start, tracing that, that's another. But I didn't notice the blackface in the children production. That's why I thought I'm not going to talk about that. But we did have, Othello and all kind of, classical plays with the blackface. But that's something else for somebody else maybe to do. That's, also another part is to trace. I did one for one of the presentations for the conference, representation of transatlantic slave trade in Lithuanian culture, generally, not just still children, but generally. It's also something else, kind of connected, but it's another huge part. You also would think that we didn't have nothing. Lithuanians didn't travel much, in that times. And I traced, for example, what was interesting for me, the first picture of African-American, first photograph made by Lithuanian artist who traveled, which was only beginning of 20th century, but we have it, which was African-American woman picture standing somewhere. I couldn't find anything else before that about, in all the books, they were traveling somewhere else. I mean, there is no knows even a few sentences about, the whole big part of population of America, the United States of America.
Mm.
It's about everything else, about the nature, about, streets, cities, but so they were not talking about encounters, or there were no encounters. It's another big part. So there's a lot of connected, bits into that. It's very interesting for me.
Yeah.
So.
You have any questions, or are there any questions? Yeah, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's so also interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I guess one thing that I was thinking about when we talked about sort of shifting from this historical kind of analysis, where you're really thinking about like what is facilitating these encounters in the first place, to then moving, you shifted from thinking about these encounters to then looking at the images themselves to really see kind of how people from these other parts of the world were being represented in Lithuania. And I was curious whether, like, how those physical encounters end up actually like shaping the decisions made by illustrators or designers, right? Like if the people traveling are not that like I guess I was wondering what are the more immediate sources of like inspiration for the people making the designs, and I could imagine those being very much informed by the travels and these kind of like geopolitical opportunities for encounter. But I could also imagine, like if certain films, like my family's from Lithuania, and we hear about how like certain films were from the US were watched under the Soviet, like within Soviet Lithuania. My family like emigrated during the war, so we weren't there, but from what I've heard, a lot of the movies that were displayed were films that didn't do so well in the US. And they were often they were some of the most racist kind of like films. And so there was so I'm wondering if that would have been like certain types of digital media or film media, like if there would have been other types of encounters or transnational processes that might feed into these particular tropes being reproduced. Like some of these forms of blackface are very similar to what we saw in the US, especially in the Jim Crow South, right? And so, and some of these, and they seem like they are almost like imitations of some of these minstrel show types of like icons. And so I guess I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about these transnational processes that lead to the process, the design process. And if you have any more thoughts on kind of how designers, illustrators, artists ended up forming these visual, sort of where did they get their symbols, their icons that they're pulling from? Like how did they arrive at these particular types of visual?
Yeah, when I see those blue faces, I also wonder which one does this one, where's it coming from?
Like this doesn't look to me like somebody traveled to Africa and was like, oh, this is what an African person looks like. Now I'm going to illustrate it as a cartoon, right? Like,
and it also doesn't look like that will be coming from that Soviet policy of this friendship of people that really multi-ethnical, so that then the artist should be informed how to represent. It doesn't look like, right? It's
also not like, it's not like they didn't have black. Right, there's
no, they didn't have black color.
That's like human choice, right, to make this child blue. But
and I understand what very Lithuanian motifs in this one, for example, in a lot of I don't know, something about the flowers and the way the braids are drawn. It feels like, and even that the sculpture you showed, there are these kind of folk motifs that are sort of being used and they're being blended. So there's this interesting tension between this these transnational sort of racial formations and racial sort of almost regimes of representation, and then these very local ones that are being blended in these interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very modern, very Yeah, I mean, that Lumumba's sculpture is something.
And where did you find this?
In the museum.
It was in the museum.
I mean, we have a lot of digitized materials in
Sure.
the museum. And I was just I don't know what I was Googling, probably by the country. So, and that got the
Sort of aligned with your question, I was wondering if you see a difference between representations, similar representations in coming from Moscow versus what you're seeing being created within the Soviet Baltics. And how much do you feel like the influence on the imagery was being sort of, is it a watered down version of what's happening out of Moscow? Is it a direct translation of what's happening out of Moscow? Or is it really, to use an American term, a melting pot of imagery that's coming in from the West when it did, either through Western films that came in after the war versus what might be coming out of Moscow, plus you add in a little Baltic flair with either the landscape or the folk motif that you add to it. So how much difference do you see between representations that are sort of Moscow based versus what might have been made by Baltic illustrators and artists?
Thank you for the question. So initially I was supposed to go for my research trip to Moscow and St. Petersburg archive to actually exactly trace that, or to look, at some degree to that material, and whether we were just copy pasting or we actually added something else. So but because of the war in Ukraine, I couldn't go that, and I'm not going to go that. So I switched to the Baltic archives and libraries. And actually, in the beginning, I was like, so I'm not going to get this big, which in my head was still like this central. So I need to go there because, the Soviet Republic. So yes, as you said, that was one kind of opinion. So we copy pasted. And then I realized actually that's a good shift, because now I can look into the Baltic context and to see us more independently, and where it doesn't mean that I don't understand that we got a lot of influence from Moscow, but I could think more independently and to see the Baltic context, in more, independent from the Moscow. And actually, even if we're three small countries, there is still a lot of differences when you look into the presentations, because artistic schools were different. So even talking, I think I mentioned this already to somebody, that in Estonia, they are presented their artworks in the children magazines, they usually full with humor. I mean, like with any magazines for kids. And Estonian sense of humor is different from Lithuanian sense of humor. So the way they present Africa and Asia is different. I can't yet, I tried kind of to find an example. It's difficult, I need to find that, something. When we talk about sense of humor, you need to be sure that it will be funny for you, otherwise, but it's different. So that's already, it's not related to the Moscow at all. It's related to our own cultures and our lifestyles. So that's so I'm really happy with that shift, kind of now help me to see a bit more, to go deeper into Baltic context. So yes, I can't now answer your question.
Yeah.
Because of that. So.
Can I ask a really just clarifying question? So how many of these objects would you say were designed, like what proportion, if you were just to estimate, of these objects were actually like designed entirely by people in Lithuania versus objects that were translated or adapted from designed somewhere else and then maybe translated into Lithuanian or translated into Latvian or Estonian, but they had been written and illustrated primarily, somewhere else, whether it was in the Soviet Union or in Moscow originally, or even Uncle Tom's Cabin is obviously written in the US and then translated, modified for this context. Do you have a sense of how much of this is translated material versus sort of original?
Yeah, difficult to estimate like that. I would say half and half, but it's it's really just kind of guessing. But
that could be an interesting kind of thing to use for comparison, right? To kind of tease out.
And to see how the representations might be different based on, I actually wondered a similar question, but comparing magazines to whether they're children's books or novels in some way, because magazines tend to be time bound, right? This issue came out on this date and it reflects on things that happened, in the recent past, whereas a novel is a little bit more timeless. Not that it doesn't reflect on history, it certainly does. But it then would make sense that you would have a picture of people at the, was it Artjak conference. And so is that more of an ideological vehicle, the magazine, than the novel might be, or the children's book? And how does that influence depiction, right? Of how you're depicting things. It might be an interesting thing to
or maybe using ideology in different ways, right? like a magazine or newspaper using ideology to make a statement about a current event versus trying to really socialize like, a person to think within the realms of a certain ideological system. That's interesting, you know, over time versus.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I have one last question in our last few minutes. And I was really struck by something that you said at the very beginning of the presentation, that in Lithuania, you literally don't always have the language, the words to discuss some of these racial issues. And that you often bring in US or Russian words to take the place. What does that mean for conversations about race, especially as the world is more globalized? We're seeing migration patterns are vast and changing. What does that mean for conversations about race? Or if that's too broad and outside of your area, because you're an art historian, what does it maybe say about how issues of race or even just representation are handled in modern day media, modern day children's literature?
It does say a lot.
Yeah.
You're correct. It is difficult. So sometimes even I notice that I would use English words when I talk about racial issues. And to talk about this in English, for example, when I teach at university, I teach in English. So I have a whole lecture dedicated to race and racism and colorism in Asia and Africa. So that's easy, that's English. But specifically in this work, I want to, to kind of get to Lithuania, to talk about this in Lithuanian, because that's, that's where we are. So, and also English words brings, a bit different context, different meanings, different, kind of, you start thinking in different, I mean, it implies something different,
right?
Exactly, that's external. So when I'm aware of that, that's okay. But sometimes you just use and then like, okay, so it's not really relevant to our context to try to use another word. But it is difficult. Yeah, we don't have any, like, we're not used to talk about this.
Yeah.
Not at all, and they're not in Lithuanian. So, so that I hope I'll try to do.
So what are your immediate next steps about trying to bring together your analysis of the imagery that you've shown us today?
You mean that hundreds of steps, right?
Yes.
I still wondering, should I go and check the Soviet magazines? That first thing, or that will bring another huge thing for me, this the Murzilka and Pionierskaya Pravda, or it will be would be good for comparison. That will bring too much. So that's one thing. So I'll probably do that because we have those pioneers newspapers in both free countries. So probably need to check the Russian one because it was also circulated in politics together with local languages.
And surely had an impact on local publishers and local illustrators who were then.
Yeah, at least then I could clearly see if Lithuanian version of this pioneer newspaper was copy pasting or it focused on some other different issues at the same time. So that one thing that I need to do. Then the dolls, that the topic that's I'm here. I still hope I'll get that secondary literature. I already ordered about it's like the whole, but also this literature is very American. I need to still be rooted in Lithuanian context. So how to combine that? Because if those dolls were produced in Lithuania for Lithuanians, I can't bring just that simple, just American book and use it. It's not. So I need to think about that. Yeah. That will be the second. And there's many others. Yeah. So
best of luck as you figure all of those things out. And thank you so much for joining us today for this.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the audience.